966.
We are pleased to be speaking now with Dr. Mark Thompson, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Program at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, and Dr. Neil Quilliam, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Mark and Neil are authors of the newly published book, Governance and Domestic Policymaking in Saudi Arabia, Transforming Society, Economics, Politics, and Culture. Through case studies, the book examines Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 and National Transformation Plan, but shifts the focus from successes and failures to instead evaluate the actual processes of domestic policymaking and governance that are being mapped out to achieve them. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the 966 today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
We are delighted you're with us. We've been anxiously awaiting this. Mark, you now entered the hallowed halls of the Repeat 90, the 966 guest. Neil, welcome. We're delighted you could join us today from the UK. I wanted to, before we jump into the book, which is fascinating, and we're excited about that, and really glad to have the opportunity to talk about it with you two today. I wanted to congratulate you, Mark, on recently entering Islam. And again, we were laughing beforehand. You just did your first Umrah, and you came back with the Hajj flu.
Yes, that's correct, which I think is part of the process. I think that you have to do that.
Just any comments on the experience? It must have been extraordinary.
Actually, funny enough, obviously a lot of people have been asking me about what it was like to go on Umrah for the first time, to go to Mecca for the first time. And the word that I've used, the most is actually extraordinary. It's very difficult to put the experience into words because it's unlike anything that I have ever experienced in my life anywhere. It's a completely unique experience in every way. And it's simultaneously a very individual experience spiritually, and yet collective as well, because you're part of this huge international group of people from all over the world, and it was obviously there were considerable numbers of people when I was there, because obviously it's between between the last Eid and Hajj coming up fairly soon. But yes, it's extraordinary and it's remarkable, and I think regardless of whether if anybody experiences this, I think regardless of whether you're a spiritual person, religious person or not, I think it would be almost impossible not to be actually moved by this incredibly unique experience. It's very difficult to put into words, but it's I'm still processing it actually.
I was born and raised Christian. I'm envious. I would love to feel that.
Yes,
it must have been extraordinary, as you say.
It is extraordinary, and the traditions, the Islamic history, everything is run so deep and is so powerful as well, I think. And as I said, it's very difficult not to be moved by this and not to be sort of to feel that you're part of this. It really is. It is an extraordinary experience. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. Let's turn to this book. And before we turn to this book, I think our listeners and viewers should know that Dr. Mark Thompson and Dr. Neil Quilliam are really, in essence, the Lennon and McCartney of Saudi Arabia socioeconomics. They've sort of established it and set a level of expertise that will be unparalleled, just as in that songwriting duo. But you've been working together since 2014. You've done authored previous books, one on policymaking in the GCC, one on Saudi youth. I guess you got one coming out on Saudi Arabia soft power. Is that correct?
Neil?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We do. We're working on that currently, and we will be holding a workshop in Cambridge in July, and hopefully the outcome of that workshop will be another book. I'm not quite sure who's Lennon and McCartney in this duo, but I rather like that idea. But yeah, we've been working together, as you say, since 2014. And I think we've sort of, we found a very good way of working together, a very good rhythm. Mark, being based in the Kingdom, and me sort of being in London and moving back and forth. And I mean, something that Mark has really brought, and I think that's really important to sort of scholarship and research of the region, is he's had this sort of privileged position where he's taught so many young Saudis over the years, and he's got sort of access points, if you like, that academics such as myself or policy people like myself who sit outside the kingdom just simply don't have. So that sort of bridge between the two has been very strong, and I think that's enabled us to sort of draw on different strengths, which has ultimately resulted in these series of edited books. And you would see throughout the progression of the projects that we've worked on, increasing numbers of young Saudi voices coming through that. And I think that's very important, to the field of scholarship itself.
Well, nobody else is doing this level of work or this range of work, and it's invaluable, especially at this juncture when we're seeing such transformation in Saudi Arabia. So Lucian gave a great intro. So governance and domestic policymaking in Saudi Arabia transforms society, economics, politics, and culture. I didn't realize the publication date was supposed to be June 16th, but I went on to Amazon and I realized I could download this on Kindle. I just discovered this earlier this week. So it's available for all you viewers on Kindle, and I don't know, in hardback and softcover. I will say this: it's also not badly priced. I mean, so many of these are just extraordinarily expensive, but it's quite reasonable. So just so anybody's thinking of getting the book, I think the Kindle I downloaded was $17.
Yes, I think the ebook is probably the easiest way to do this, and I think obviously now, in the past, a lot of these books were initially published as a hardback, they were extremely expensive because they were really targeted at university libraries and things like that, which of course cut out, and they would then publish a paperback version of it, but not really to sort of like 2 years down the track or something. But fortunately, in the last couple of years, we've seen the sort of simultaneous publications now in the hardback, the soft copy, and most importantly, the ebooks, and they're all available. And as you say, they're very reasonably priced.
Yes. So I encourage you. So I'm going to quote yourselves back to you as our start, just so you can give us a context of what you were thinking when you put this book together. Quote, Lennon and McCartney, quote, "This edited volume aims to go far beyond the headlines and succinct stories that often describe the success or failure to date of Saudi Vision 2030 and the NTP 2020, National Transformation Program 2020. Much of the literature, analysis, and reportage on Saudi Arabia usually highlight areas of, quote, high politics, unquote, such as foreign policy and the succession, while disregarding the less glamorous area of low politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yet young people are the key to Saudi Arabia's future prosperity, and this necessitates studying the issues, many in the area of, quote, low politics, unquote, that they believe are important, such as employment, housing, healthcare, and the rising cost of living." Can you expand on what you mean by low politics?
Well, I mean, I use this quite a lot when I'm sort of giving lectures or teaching, what have you, and the difference between sort of high politics and low politics. Meaning, the high politics are the sort of the foreign policy, the succession, the security, the sort of, if you like, as you said, the glamorous issues, the ones that tend to get the most attention, the ones that grab the headlines, the ones that very often, you find quite a lot of people working on because of that. Whereas the low political issues are the bread and butter issues, the nitty gritty, the things that actually affect everybody's lives. Professor Tim Niblock, who very kindly reviewed this manuscript when it was first submitted, and who provided an endorsement for the book, which is actually on the back cover. I mean, I think he hits the nail on the head when he says that, the book provides a quite different level of inquiry from that of most other works. Its focus is not on the big economic and strategic issues facing the kingdom, but on the processes and problems of policy making on everyday matters. And then to stress what he says here, for most Saudis, it is at this level that they experience most directly the impact of government policy, whether positively or negatively. And I think that really hits, that really sums it up. It's looking at how does this actually affect people's everyday lives? Because when you are in the Majlis, when you are in the Diwania, when you are in the Istiraha, whatever, the coffee shop, and you are talking to people, and you are talking about their concerns, their aspirations, they very rarely say, oh, what really concerns me is sort of foreign policy vis-a-vis whatever, unless it's something that's very topical, or there's just been a video on TikTok or something. But, in general, the things that people talk about, like they talk about everywhere in the world, are the things that impact their lives. And that's no different from the States, from Great Britain, wherever.
Yeah, I think traditionally, we would get excited about succession, or we get excited about security, as Mark's kind of alluded to, all those foreign policy issues. But I think the kingdom previously didn't really open itself up sufficiently for sort of academics or researchers to go into the country to sort of lift the bonnet or the hood of the car and look at the inside. And I think there has there's clearly been a big change in the kingdom over the past 10 years effectively. And I think researchers can now actually get on the ground and start to look at those sort of those daily issues, the daily issues of governance. What's it like to sort of run up against the bureaucracy? And I think as external researchers, we could never really consider that. We would go in, we would meet the same set of individuals in the kingdom. There would be maybe 20 people that you would go and talk to, and you'd say, okay, so what does the succession look like? And you'd come up with the same sets of questions, and you came away with the same set of answers. So that's where a kind of echo chamber would come. Whereas now, we're able to kind of penetrate the kingdom in a way that was never, we were never able to in the past. So you can really understand where those issues are, sort of in the cultural space, in the religious space, with entrepreneurs, wherever it may be, and basically sort of look at some of the issues that are just every day. And I think that's very much what we've been trying to do. But the environment has shifted so much so that we're able to do that.
So, if you think of the time, if you think of the guests that you've had on, this podcast over the last few months, and the type of topics that they've been discussing and the issues that they've been talking about, again, there's a lot of topics and issues here that, as Neil said, maybe previously 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe just wouldn't have come up because the landscape, the environment was so very different.
And that's a good point. And I've been delighted that almost everyone we've asked to be on the show has said yes. And if they didn't say yes, it was largely because of other constraints, and which prevail here in the U.S. So, for example, government officials, they're reluctant or have to get clearance. Same thing here. I'd love to have the new ambassador to Saudi Arabia join us, but he's not going to be able to until he's confirmed, and so on and so forth. It's a different deal. But you're exactly right. So what you're saying, so there's a sea change essentially from when you published your first book in 2014 to now. And now, so you're saying you not only do you have access to sort of designated interlocutors, which is how Saudi Arabia has worked in for many years. You had a set of group, as you say, Neil, of folks you went and talked to, and they were okay. Government was okay. Now you have access, unfettered. I won't say unfettered, but you have sufficient access to youth, entrepreneurs, women, clerics. Is that correct?
Yes. I've always had a lot of access because of my various positions here. But I suppose it's, ease of access has changed, of course. When I wrote my first book back in sort of 2012, 13, I was able to interview like 120 people. A lot of them were not the usual sorts of people that were on the interview circuit, as it were. But of course, it was, it was a little bit more difficult then for doing some of these interviews for very obvious reasons. So that sort of ease of access has changed. And just as Neil said, the ease of coming to the kingdom has changed. The bureaucracy has lessened, whether it's for business, for tourism, the fact that you can travel so much more easily around the kingdom today. And all of this is sort of, it's all sort of happened together, and attitudes as well, and the desire to engage, and people wanting to explain, wanting to talk to you, and wanting to explain to you about, what they're doing in their particular sector, or what they're hoping to do, or obstacles they're facing, or creating new sectors, creating new opportunities. So there's also this desire to sort of to engage and to sort of to talk about this. And I think we also have to remember that we're benefiting now. I think we mentioned this in the last time we spoke. We're also benefiting from the scholarship program, from the massive expenditure on education and all of this. I mean, all of those seeds were all sown, and now the benefits are being reaped.
Well, it was interesting. We featured in our SUSTIG review, our daily newsletter on Saudi Arabia, and a recent study by a group called CARMA, CARMA, who do media. They study media patterns, and they discovered that from 2020 to 2021, Saudi Arabia, in fact, has made some significant headway in terms of its public relations, and the Vision 2030 message. It has come to the fore in terms of how people view Saudi Arabia. But let's talk about Vision 2030. This is really since 2016, it's really been the organizing idea for Saudi Arabia, both governmentally and increasingly for society. The sort of the benchmark is Vision 2030. I mean, it to a lesser level because it's more implementation, the NTP 2020. But David Jones in his piece, Kingmakers and Knaves, he's talking about consultants, and he makes the point that many countries, Saudi Arabia on occasion itself, make a mistake of conflating strategy with policy. And I think this is sort of what you guys are trying to get to. There's the strategy, but there's also the on-the-ground policy. Are those two running in sync, or where do you see, in terms of the Vision 2030 vision, where do you see some discrepancies from actual facts on the ground?
I think the strategy, the direction of travel is clear as to where the vision's tending and where the country's heading. There is a gap. There is a difference in terms of policy. And I think that's just simply because, this is a huge transformation that's taking place, and a big transition of society as well. And no matter how hard you will it, it's just not going to happen overnight. I mean, the foundations, the planks really have to be put in place. And I think what we've seen, throughout the book, and also just through our own engagements, is capacity is being built. The capacity, you can't just turn a switch, and the capacity is there overnight, that you can build a policy and then you can put processes in place. I mean, to a large extent, what we've seen is the sort of the slow consensus that used to govern the kingdom has kind of been put on hold, or certainly suspended. And in its place, you've got these relatively new institutions that are being created. And you have individuals who are put in at the top, who are given the authority to sort of circumvent the bureaucracy, which would have frustrated processes in the past. So you can push ahead to get things done quite quickly. But what isn't really in place then are the sort of policies, procedures, and processes to make sure things are fully enacted, if that makes sense. So you can blast through the roadblocks. You could say, I want this to happen. This is going to happen in 2 days' time. Everyone mobilizes around that and makes it happen. But where's the sustainability? And that's what's still being built and put in place. So I'd say that, that's the difference between strategy and getting the policy really into play. You can make things happen quickly, but if the challenge is that you can't really do it over a sustained period until you build the capacity. And when we're talking about Saudi youth, I think, they themselves are going through that process of building and developing, their own capacity, and they need to gain their own experience in order to make things work.
Absolutely. And if you, as Neil just said, so if you decide that you want to create a new university, for example, and there are numerous projects for new universities, which I'm sure you've heard about, but you can build the infrastructure, you can create a physical university, but a university is not actually about the buildings. It's about the people. It's about the research. It's about the publications. It's about everything that goes with that. And that takes time. You can't just sort of build, that you can't just sort of go boom and that's it. This takes time to build, and it's the individuals, the capacity, it's something that, maybe in 10 years, maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years. And I think, that's something that has to sort of happen organically.
In everything we talk about on the 966, there's an X factor. And by that, I mean, we frequently talk about the Vision 2030 aspirations. We frequently talk about, progress in tourism across any number of sectors and this and that, energy, the whole spectrum. Mark, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we cover an extraordinary range of topics. The X factor is exactly what you're talking about, capacity. And, we can say what capacity means. Is that education? Is that training? It's all of these, I assume.
Yeah.
And you can't snap your fingers and make that happen.
No.
And I assume this is what you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, a lot of this is experience, isn't it? I mean, you gain experience by when you have a predominantly young population who have, because of the scholarship program and because of the money spent on education, whatever, who have been feeding into the system, which they are now. And it's enormous change, as you know. But at the same time, they still have to gain that sort of experience. I mean, it doesn't come overnight. I mean, the person you are in terms of your professional life at 30 and the person you are at 50 are two completely different people, as we know, because of that. You have to gain this.
So you may not be able to speak to this if this is in fact the X factor, but and I'll ask you to maybe you have great expertise on this, and maybe I'm asking you to step outside of your comfort zone. But one of the chapters is young people and vocational education choices in Saudi Arabia, implications for aligning policy with aspirations. This is Hannah Al-Mubayed, who is in your shop, which, by the way, so the King Faisal Foundation, an extraordinary institution, and also the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, which you two are affiliated with, as well as Hannah. But also there's an Al Faisal University. But so the question is this: the educational approach is changing in many ways. So, for example, the Abdullah Scholarships, which was started in 2005 and is now the custodian of the Two Holy Mosques Scholarship Program, which has had, as you have mentioned, Mark, an extraordinary impact on Saudi society. It's been revised and refined, so it's a little smaller, much more targeted. But also, are there not significant initiatives at the vocational training level as well? And I guess the question is that education universe, that capacity building universe, that leads to a result where Saudi Arabia has the educated, skilled up Saudis available to do what they want to do to transform their economy. Is that being put in place? Is it moving along?
I mean, yes. I mean, this is a work in progress. I mean, maybe we could have Hannah with us next time, because she's the complete expert.
As I said, I may be asking you to step outside, but
no, it's fine. No. I mean, yes. I mean, this is something that is, is a work in progress. It is something that's happening. I mean, educational reform is always, is always contentious, and it's not just in the kingdom, in various other places. And, educational reform has been discussed ever since I first arrived in the kingdom. I think one of the issues that we see with educational reform in not just in Saudi Arabia, but certainly within the region. And in fact, we had a webinar about a month or so ago about this with Hannah, actually, who was involved, and some other regional experts, talking about problems related to the educational reform. And I think one of the biggest problems that we find, and again, I think this is universal, is that a great many of the people who are involved in educational reform and who draft policy and who look at, draft the documents and things like this, have actually never actually been in the classroom, have never actually taught, have never actually experienced what it's actually like. And that actually the teachers and the people like this are not consulted, or even the students very often. This is, as I say, I don't think this is just a problem related to Saudi Arabia. Teacher training, of course, is also another huge issue in terms of, it's all very well, saying we're going to teach critical thinking, we're going to teach philosophy, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But if you don't, because again, it goes back to going back to capacity. If we don't actually have the people who are skilled and qualified to actually do this, then it's not going to happen. So it's one thing to sort of look at, sort of drafting policies, and then quite another thing sometimes at sort of implementing them. I think as well, in terms of educational reform and sort of reforming, the curricula and things like this, yes, we see this happening, and we see that there's now more awareness, I would say, of the demands of the labour market. Although I think sometimes there's still too much of an issue of sort of trying to sort of fit young people, if you like, into certain sort of boxes, as it were, rather than actually educating them and sort of giving them the choices and what have you. And of course, there's also the issue as well, is that if you have, again, these are all universal issues. If you actually have, educational policies that are only sort of thinking about sort of the jobs of today, for example, rather than actually what the labour market is going to look like in 20 years' time, which I think is also something that is extremely important and, again, is universal. Neil, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I would just really add, I think, I think, again, it's probably universal, but I think vocational training programs tend to lag behind
Yes.
the required skills are almost always, a good half a decade behind that. So that's something to take into account. But I mean, we are really talking about sort of, cross-generational change here, I think. I mean, it's, children just joining schools today are going to have to go through this process. So it's not, again, it's not something that you can switch overnight. But, we were speaking to Hannah yesterday, and, she was also reflecting on, attitudes of families, expectations that the families will have on their children. It's good to be a doctor or an engineer, yes, or whatever, and that, I mean, again, that happens in every country and every society, but where you've got a high focus on that, or a concentration on that, it's probably a less sort of efficacious path, or considered to be a less efficacious path, to go to vocational training college, to go and work in a very different field, or to go and work in tourism. I mean, so this whole sort of change of mindset has to take place. So it doesn't just sort of sit in the classroom or on a vocational training classroom. It's got to happen in society as well, with with your peers, with your siblings, with your parents and grandparents. So that's quite a long journey.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, that journey is happening. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the change in mentalities, the change in mindsets has been, I think, very positive, and has happened in a relatively short space of time, in terms of, the types of jobs that young Saudis are now prepared to do, the types of choices that they've got. I think in the past, one of the big problems was, as Neil said, if you were a young man, it was either sort of you go into the military, or it's engineer or medicine, and that was really about it. But I mean, and I think, a lot of young people simply were not aware of any other choices. It wasn't just that those were the only things available. They didn't actually know that anything else was available a lot of the time. Whereas now we see, because of the creation of new sectors, because we see, there's so much more awareness individually amongst young people about what they can or can't do, what they're interested in. And this is, we see this changing very, very quickly. The attitudes to part-time jobs, attitudes to volunteering. I mean, all of this has happened, in the space of really a couple of years. I mean, I was in Taif just before I went to Makkah last week, and was amazed by the changes that I saw there, and huge sort of new sort of shopping malls come sort of recreation sort of spaces that had opened there very recently in the last couple of months, and all these coffee shops being run by young Saudis with Saudi waiters and Saudi waitresses, and they're all incredibly proud of their coffee shops and all sparkling new and everything like this, and it was great. It was lovely. It was really, really nice. Very positive.
Just one other thing, if I could just jump in, Mark. During my last visit to the kingdom, you and I were talking with some of your former students about the importance of career advice. I mean, that doesn't really exist, I don't think, at the moment, and that's an area that's really lacking, and the role of mentorship as well. Yes. This seems to be something that young Saudis seem to be crying out for, and I think those are important facets that would help part of this transition.
Yeah, I mean, Hannah and I, obviously, we work together. As you said, Richard, correctly, Hannah is at the King Faisal Centre as well, and we work together on various projects related to this. And we published something on good jobs, bad jobs not long ago. We're actually working on a paper at the moment about changing attitudes to certification, attitudes, young Saudis' preferences or not of professional certification over academic certification. But all of this is part of that transition, and all of this is part of that change. But, we have identified, very much the fact this lack of career guidance at a very early, and we're not talking career guidance at tertiary level, when they're sort of senior students and they're just about to go out and enter the labour market, because way too late then. And a lot of them would have already done, their internships or their co-ops, their summer training and what have you. But really, sort of the type of maybe career guidance that you get in other countries, which is sort of, introduced at secondary school, for example, career fairs, job fairs and things. I mean, I remember going to one when I was 15, I think, which was, a few years ago now, but 5 years ago, but But that is, and I think that's also very important, because that goes back to, you've got the vision creating these new sectors, and the new types of jobs, and you need to create awareness of that as well. You need to create awareness that there are these not just jobs, but there are actually these careers that maybe a lot of young people just simply never heard of.
I think that's fascinating to hear you talk about it as part of your research and what you've seen. I mean, there was a time the gold standard was a job at Saudi Aramco. Increasingly, there are more options. But again, we're talking about, if you want to work in tourism, PIF or this sort of thing. But again, that's sort of the top level educated folks.
Yes.
Who have maybe had a chance to study abroad or gotten further education. The majority of others need to be, find, fulfilling, rewarding jobs that they can get because they've earned, skills. And that's, as we talked about, that's the process. It's, as you say, Neil, is generational and unavoidably generational.
Yeah, and that's the process that also, you need to start changing mindsets. You need to show people that actually, that you can have a very rewarding and lucrative career, as an electrician or as a plumber or as a builder or what have you. I mean, this is something that this is in the process of changing.
You know, interesting. One of the Dave DeRoche, friend of ours, and is also a fellow member of the returnee 966 returnee. Yes,
and who has a chapter in the book, of course,
and
has a chapter in the book, and I look forward to reading it. It's building defense capacity in King Salman and Saudi Arabia. So it's one of, by the way, so for listeners, it's one of 10 chapters in the book, and we could run through it, but they're all fascinating and they all take a sector, and so I'll be really interested to get through it. But Dave has commented, I think more than once on our show, is that when you say, if you're looking at let's say a Lucid manufacturing plant at King Abdullah Economic City, which is coming, you have to have craftsmen. You have to have people who, and you can't just have engineers. You have to have people who are skilled metal benders or any number of things. And these things you just don't conjure out of midair.
No, you have to train people.
Right.
So, I mean, it's fascinating how, whenever you have these discussions about all of this, I mean, how, nearly always it goes back to education, of some sort.
The X factor. Yeah.
Yes. The X factor, education. Yes.
Fascinating. So, Lucian, I'm gonna get to some big ideas that they mention in the introduction to the book. Is there anything you wanted to add on this?
No, that's good. Let's do it.
So big idea. So first of all, I don't want to not emphasize enough what you both of you have just said. That X factor of education underpins everything that Saudi Arabia wants to achieve. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It really is. Yeah.
And it's something that we on the 966 like to look at because, Saudi Arabia does very well with the grand announcement and has no shortage of aspiration in terms of its vision, which we applaud. But, the generational need to build capacity is first and foremost, has to be first and foremost for them. So this is, I'm gonna run through these things, three things that you said in this, and I think they're interesting, and if you can address them. Unveiling Saudi Vision 2030 in April 2016, had three indirect consequences. First, they raised expectations to an unrealistic degree among Saudi Arabia's predominantly young population, whose views and aspirations frequently outpace the government's programs to influence and shape societal and national development. How about we take these one at a time? So I gather what I hear is that this idea, the informing idea of Vision 2030, the reforms in terms of social reforms, the opening up society for youth, has inspired and encouraged and incented them to really think. Are they getting, are their expectations raised to an unrealistic degree?
I think that was, obviously at the time that was the concern, because it was so, this was something so unprecedented in the fact that you had a leader talking to a young leader talking to young people on television, talking about things that they were concerned about. And that was really not something that had ever really happened before. I was sitting with young people watching it. You could see their reactions to this. I mean, it was as though, he opened that door that they'd all been sort of pushing at for a long time, and they all collectively got up and went through it.
They didn't need to be. They didn't need to be invited again.
No, they did not. Because I think what you have to remember is that Saudi Vision 2030 was in very many ways a response to what was already happening. Those bottom-up pressures were already there, which was inevitable when you have this very young population, which is increasingly well educated, and of course, especially since 2009 with the social media revolution, online 24/7, as we've talked about before, and other people have talked about. Social media usage, internet penetration, and all these things are sky high here. So people, their awareness of all these, I can do this, I can do that, I want to do this, I want to do that, was all sort of there, but they sort of felt constrained because they couldn't. So what they were doing was that they were creating these types of things for themselves. So the vision responded to that. And of course, once that door opened, there was suddenly, it naturally, they sort of just went through it, as I said. So, I think, obviously, with the pandemic, obviously, had an impact on all of this and what we're now sort of seeing sort of post-pandemic. I think that the most important thing that has happened in terms of the vision is that yes, it raised expectations, but I think, as we just mentioned before, it also has changed the way that people think about a lot of things. And it's broadened outlooks, it's broadened, people's awareness of the opportunities and the choices that they might be able to make. Not that they necessarily are all going to do that, but I think that's happened, and I think that's it has had a fundamental impact on the kingdom and the way what you talk about with people, how people see their futures, how people see how they can contribute. It's made a massive impact, and I think it was very interesting last year when the Crown Prince gave his speech in Ramadan, when he was basically, sort of saying to, this very young population, we are making progress, there are bumps in the road, but, stay on board and what have you. And of course, what was also very interesting about that speech, that interview he gave on Rotana, was that actually he spent the majority of his time talking about issues in the realm of low politics, as we started off, talking about this 966, showing actually awareness on his part of how important those were. So, yeah, there's no doubt expectations were raised, but I think, that the journey since then, obviously we've seen changes happen.
But I also, I have two additional points. One is, I think until that moment, things had been building, but change had always been slow and incremental, and older generations were conscious and well aware of that. And as Mark describes it, the door was just suddenly flung open, and yes. It's like, wow. That's just like lifting the lid on something, and obviously expectations were going to be raised. And I think about this quite a lot. I've got a 19-year-old son. And his expectations at 19 are massive. He expects he's going to have the biggest house on earth. He's going to do this, this, and this. And that's no bad thing, actually. So if you have a youthful population that has expectations or ambitions, that's not, we shouldn't frown upon that. We can be a bit cynical and say, well, we don't think 2030 is going to hit all its marks. Obviously, there are 100 reasons why that's not the point. But we don't have to douse that kind of ambition or those expectations. Why would we want to curtail that? Particularly if these are young folks. Yes, they will be disappointed, as we all end up disappointed one way or another, because we can't have everything that we want. So I think sometimes we need to sort of bear that sort of in mind.
It is, if you ever did a case study on a paradigm shift, this would have to be in there. I just think because quite rapidly everyone's perception and framework changed, and this is one of the things I think we have difficulty with an American audience or a Western audience, is believing this is actually the case. And one of the things I think on the 966 I hope we're addressing. So the second thing that you mentioned was the introduction of Vision 2030. Was that it shone a light on the existing social contract. And I think this is especially true when later, Vision 2030 was 2016, but then the VAT, for example, was applied in 2018 and then increased in 2020. These are different social contracts, essentially the re-examining the nature of the relationship between state and society. Have you seen that?
Yes, but I also think that obviously we talk briefly in the book about the pandemic, because the research for the book was done pre-pandemic, and it was based on the workshop that we had at Cambridge University in 2019. And the reason the book was delayed somewhat was because of the pandemic, because we actually had to send everything back to sort of, talk about the pandemic. We couldn't publish a book without mentioning the pandemic. So the relationship between state and society had been changing quite a bit, in that the sort of the legitimacy was increasingly based on government providing services and sort of security to sort of wider Saudi societies and everything. And then, of course, the pandemic really highlighted that. And the government's successful dealing with the pandemic in Saudi Arabia, which they did extremely well here. The tech, tawakkalna, all these things, which I think you've spoken about on other episodes and what have you. That really that reinforced that particular bond, whereby that it was the job of the government to look after society, if you like. And so that's something, and that's something that, again, I think was very positive. So we have definitely seen a shift in this relationship over the last couple of years. Neil, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm actually already just sort of gaming this through in my mind, because we've been talking about sort of shifting and changing social contracts in the Gulf, for a good decade. Yeah. And where, states will provide those services, and there's a growing expectation that services should be provided. But at the same time, I mean, what we're seeing, and again, it's the environment in which the youth are operating, and it's kind of it's complicated. But there are those who seem to be taking on greater responsibility for themselves. Those who are those entrepreneurs are sort of moving into that space. So I think there's this idea that the state just kind of hands out, and we hear this constantly. The parents or the grandparents or even the great grandparents had a different relationship to the state, and that's undergone some changes. And I think maybe the expectations from the state are diminishing, and it doesn't necessarily operate at an individual's level, but some individuals or families are sort of feeling more independent or moving away from those constraints. But as you say, Mark, during the pandemic, I mean, the state was very present, right? Yeah. I mean, it was very much, we're here, we are your patron or whatever it might be, and we're going to manage and take care of this. So I don't see this as something being in sort of equilibrium or balance. It's something that's just undergoing a change. Trying to identify a spot where that is quite difficult. But it was quite. There was, for example, when during the very strict curfew here at the, in the first phase of the pandemic, there was resistance to some of the fact that it was so strict, and certainly when everybody was curfewed at home in Eid, for example, and nobody was allowed out of their houses and what have you, and it was very, very, very strict. But later on, of course, people realized that actually, thank goodness that happened. And we're very glad that actually the government did take this very strict line here. So yes, no, I mean it's that's and that's obviously sort of all still playing out as it is all over the world as the pandemic ebbs.
Mark, I take issue with being Americans. Lucian and I, we can talk about resistance to government policy with regard to the pandemic. So maybe let's call the Saudi version a form of mild complaining. All right.
Yeah, mild complaining. Yes, mild.
We'll talk about resistance here in the U.S.
Mild. Yeah, when I say resistance, I mean more.
I understand.
Yeah.
No, and your point is well made. When I talk about the social contract, people talk, when they hear that, they go, oh my goodness, radical things are happening. No, it's an evolution. And it's being embraced, I think, and obviously by the younger generation who are more comfortable with it, change. But it is an evolution. And the third, and if this sort of segues into the third point, and one of the things that you make is that this announcement implied and also encouraged or increased anticipation of greater government accountability and increased participation of decision-making processes. I think clearly there seems to be greater government accountability. even within the government itself, there's the standards of accountability have been elevated considerably. But Lucia and I often remark on the fact that there are now avenues and means and platforms to comment on government performance for a lot of ministries. Is that correct?
Neil, do you want to come?
Yes, I mean, no, that is correct. And just reflecting on the conversation we were having with Hannah yesterday, absolutely, accountability as part of new governance, and that was very rarely there in any sort of formal or institutional way. There were means to maybe exercise some influence through Worcester, where you could seek alternative or informal pathways. But there are much more sort of formal ways, and that accountability sort of sits. We're not talking about high politics, political accountability, but we're talking about sort of low politics, service provision accountability. Right. So suddenly the citizen has more agency than they would have had in the past. There's more recourse, and that's empowerment within that lower sphere. And that means officials and those working in the bureaucracy or the administration can be held to account. And those that are held to account and have failed their duties are out of service. Hannah was saying yesterday, that is something that's really quite new. I mean, that's come with Vision 2030.
Yeah. I mean, and you look at this, the you remarked when you were here a few months ago about the change in the standards of service that you saw here.
No, absolutely. There's been a big shift in that certainly. Actually, just on another point, I mean, something that I find fascinating, and we were talking a little bit about it earlier, and it's kind of just remarking on that is, typically, say 10, 15 years ago when I was going to the kingdom, I would have my list of my 10 or 15 people that I would want to meet, and, have to wait for the last minute to actually get the okay to meet them, because aligning calendars is always complicated. I would very, very rarely bump into people in the street and have conversations. But when I wander in Riyadh now, I mean, quite a few times I've been approached by like young Saudis will say, "Are you a tourist? Are you lost? Do you want some help?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that whole kind of space is just like it's really just opened up, and for very normal conversations which were often absent, and you can have a coffee with them and you can just talk about things. They're not going to answer questions on succession because they're not interested, and you wouldn't raise it. But if you want to talk about something else, absolutely. And I think that's generally sort of, reflected in that space.
Yeah, no, that's completely normal now. Absolutely, that is, even away from this, the more affluent areas of Riyadh, should we say, where you would probably find more non-Saudi people, certainly Westerners. Even when you go out to the provinces and the smaller cities and everything, this is completely normal now.
So, gentlemen, this is, is there a takeaway from this book, which has come out this month, that you'd like to share with our listeners? Is there something, an overarching conclusion that you might share with us? Is there one? And it may not exist, and it may not have been the purpose, but I want to make sure we get to the gist of what you saw this book and the motivation for the book.
Neil, do you want to come in first?
So for me, I think the takeaway, and it seems a little bit sort of left of field, is that one question that I've had in my mind for the last 5 or 6 years when I've been going to Saudi quite a lot, and it's one that, when I sit in Chatham House, we chew over, are these reforms reversible? Are we going to reach a point where suddenly this is all taken away and it's like, no, we're going back to pre-2015? Now, my answer to that, as far as I can see from looking at Saudi and having worked on this book, is these changes, these reforms are irreversible. These are sort of deep-rooted changes that are taking place. This is part of a big paradigm shift, as you've called it, or transformation. It's not going to be linear. It's definitely going to be uneven. But I think it's happening at this kind of, it's not happening at the high level, it's happening at the low or the subterranean level. And I think that's important, because that's where the change really needs to take place. If it just simply happens at the top, then that's not going to percolate down. And I think sort of ownership of these processes, through sort of, lower politics, policy making and governance, is going to make these changes sustainable. So to me, that's the key takeaway. And the other point really is just what I said earlier, is that I think the country has changed to such an extent that we can no longer just content ourselves thinking, okay, who's going to be the next king or the next crown prince or the next deputy crown prince? I think we can now take a look at the kingdom at a much deeper level and try to understand more about society, some of those changes, and how decision making at the much more local level takes place. So that's it. So I think the lens is changing really, and we're able to look much deeper.
And when you have a much better educated society that is much better informed, that is much more aware of the socio-political, socio-economic issues, socio-cultural issues and what have you, then there are those conversations that are always happening, whether it's in the Majlis, whether it's in the Diwaniyah, whether it's in the Istiraha, and we know that Saudis love to sit around and talk about all of these different things. So we know that they're the discussions about how all of this post Vision 2030 in April 2016, how this is impacting on their lives, how it's impacting on the lives of their children and their grandchildren or what have you. All of this is part of the discourse. It's what everybody, people talk about normally and naturally, because it is such a huge thing that's happened. So I think, it's important to sort of to have, as Neil said, not just to look at that sort of very high level. We have to understand also about how these things play out at lower levels, and what the way people react to these things, how they see this impacting their lives, positively, negatively, whatever. Because again, it's also, Saudi Arabia is I've said this so many times, Saudi Arabia is a huge country. It's not homogenous. These things are interpreted differently in different parts of the kingdom. Employment might be important right across the kingdom, but the levels of that importance or specific areas of that importance can differ depending on where you are and who you're talking to. But what we do know is that these conversations are happening all the time, and it's important for us to try and not just understand this, but also to document this. I mean, I had a visit from a Saudi academic from Qasim this morning in my office, and we were talking exactly about this, about how very important it is to document what's happening, or what has happened since the launch of the vision and before, obviously, but to keep documenting it so that there is a historical record.
Governance and Domestic Policymaking in Saudi Arabia, Transforming Society, Economics, Politics, and Culture is the book. Dr. Mark Thompson, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Program at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, and Dr. Neil Quilliam, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That's applause, gentlemen.
Well done.
And to you too, guys.
Fascinating.
I'll wear a tie next time.
No. Let Neil be our show, our showpiece right here. I think we're all better off for it.